All right, NTB, man, people are often confused and they misuse the terms jail and prison. See, they're not used interchangeably. They're not the same thing. They are different. So let's talk about it. Jails are more for like the local towns, villages, cities, and they're used for people who are doing short term stays and people who are awaiting trials, meaning there were some criminal allegations made against this particular person. They were arrested upon probable cause, and then they were put into confinement, which is a jail. So jails are usually for short-term stays. They locally run and operated. In New York, the local jail is basically Rikers Island. That's the big one. Even though they have a lot of other little jails all around New York City, but that's the big one. In New York City being the five boroughs: Brooklyn, Bronx, Manhattan, Queens, Staten Island. So when you get to the jails, there is confinement. There are bars. Everyone's locked down. There's some movement here and there to go to the chow hall or the mess hall to eat, the shower, the outdoor recreation and things like that. But the amount of activities that go on in the jail in terms of like service, education, trades, there's not a lot going on because they're not really built for that. They're not built for people to be there for extended stays. But here's what a lot of people don't know. So the book says really short-term stay, and a short-term stay technically is anything under a year. But in New York, it's not unusual to find people who are incarcerated in the local jails way more than that. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the case of Kalief Browder, who was, I think it was a Netflix special made about him. He was falsely convicted or falsely accused and falsely arrested, placed on Rikers Island, and he got lost in the system and stayed on Rikers Island for almost 3 years. And his experience there was not unusual. It was not one that's not pretty common in terms of the treatment that he received from the correctional staff and the inmate. He was beaten. He was beaten by the guard. He was allowed to be beat. The allegations goes, other inmates were allowed to beat him. It was a heartbreaking story. It's hard to really watch because he was innocent young man, 16 years old. He was falsely accused. He's not supposed to be there, but he couldn't get off Rikers Island because he couldn't make bail, and that's another dirty little secret of this system. Some people, they get falsely accused and then they're given a $10,000 bail. And many people in the inner cities, in the quote-unquote hood, they don't have no $10,000. So he has to stay there. He's there with all these violent gangs and groups of guys, and he's a kid. He's never been through that. That's not his life. But he's standing up for himself, and that was the heartbreaking part of the Kalief Browder story, man. You know, he was a trooper, man. He was standing up for himself. He was fighting them guys, man. He was like, no, I'm not going to let y'all abuse me. He's fighting back. But he was overwhelmed. He was outnumbered, and that just wasn't his world. And a lot of people who are there in them jails, that's their world. They've been in and out of jail sometimes their whole lives, and started at 16 years old, and these guys now are, adults or 19 years old, 21 years old. And they in and out 5, 6, 7 times every summer. They on Rikers Island. So it's like a second home to them. And it's a group of them, and they basically run the place. Rikers Island is a jail that is so mismanaged and poorly run. They under a lot of scrutiny right now. There's just calls to just close that place down. There's calls for just a takeover, and just totally revamp how it's run or just shut it down. There's so much violence, so much mismanagement, so much abuse. Man, I can tell you some stories about some of the stuff that goes on there, and amongst the guards, the supervisors, and amongst the inmates. It's bad. All right, so anyway, Kalief Browder, to wrap up that part of the story, they put him in solitary confinement as a disciplinary measure. Solitary confinement is just a brutal place to put a young person or any person. It's not a place for the human mind, the human spirit to really flourish. It's a place where the human mind deteriorates and the human spirit begins to die. And everyone knows that there's no redeeming value of it, but they still use it and it just breaks people down. It makes a man basically mentally deteriorate. And unfortunately, particularly a young person whose mind is still developing, he couldn't take it, man, and it just overwhelmed him. And eventually he was let go from Rikers Island after close to 3 years, falsely detained there, and he just couldn't pull it all together. And he had a lot of support from the entertainment community, people from the entertainment world reaching out to him, just people who knew of his story reaching out to him, told him, hold your head. But it overwhelmed him, man, the experience, the trauma. And, young man just hung himself, and, he's not here anymore. Rest in peace, young man. Heartbreaking story, man. But it's not unusual. That's what those jails will do to a lot of people. They break them down mentally, they break them down emotionally, they break them down spiritually. And one of the shining points of his story was it highlighted that everyone in jail, contrary to popular belief, is not guilty. People are falsely arrested all across this country and falsely charged all the time, brought into those jails, and then just run through trauma, horrible experiences, threats, beatings, and then they are released. And maybe the charges were dropped, but the trauma remains, you understand? And so the jails are really, really bad. The prisons are more for long-term stays. The prisons are used for people who are sentenced to a year or more. Then the prisons are broken down by different levels. They have minimum, medium, max, and then they have the super max. And it's usually based upon a person's security level. A lot of people before and this is after they get sentenced, a person may lose trial and get sentenced to 10 years, 5 years, 6 years, 25 years, or even life. And then based upon their classification after the conviction or trial or plead guilty. A lot of people plead guilty. They never even convicted by trial. That's another story that maybe we need to talk about. How many people plead guilty? And some people plead guilty. They're not even guilty, but they plead guilty something to avoid the threat of harsh, long prison terms. So check out a film, Central Park 5, and you'll see that people plead guilty to things that they didn't do fairly often. It's not uncommon. Once a person gets convicted or pleads guilty for whatever reason, they'll get moved from the jail or local to the prison, which is run more by the state or federal government. And they'll either go to a medium, minimum, max, or super max. And each one has their own particular dynamics. And like, for instance, the medium facilities are facilities where you're going to have more freedom. There's not going to be a large wall around the facility. There may not be as many guards. There may not be as much movement restriction. There may not even be a lot of prison cells. There may be more dormitory type situations and arrangements where guys are in an open area just walking around. Everyone has their little cubicle. You can come and go in and out of the area pretty freely. You can go to the bathrooms, showers, maybe even to the yard without even asking or having to go through 1,000 security gates. That's not the same with a maximum facility. A maximum security facility like in New York, Attica, Clinton, Comstock, Greenhaven, Auburn. These are the more maximum security facilities where you're going to find more people who are there serving longer sentences, number one, and particularly people who are classified as a little bit more dangerous and security risks. So you're going to see less movement, much more restricted movement. More than likely, you're going to see a huge wall around the facility with guard towers, guys in the towers with guns. The movement is really, really restricted. Just to move a couple of feet, you might have to go through a security gate and then another security checkpoint, then another security checkpoint. And oftentimes, there's going to be no dormitories. There's going to be cells. And the cells per people on security are going to walk past. The guards are going to walk past the cells pretty regularly, checking on people. So there's a lack of privacy, a lot of restricted movement. But also with the jails versus the prisons, in which you might have more of is quote unquote rehabilitation programs, if that's what you want to call them, man. They might have like workshops where a guy can learn a trade or something like that. None of that stuff really works if you really look into the numbers. Recidivism rates for people coming out of prisons and jail all across America, recidivism rates talking about the people who come back after they spend time in jail or prison is high. So I think like 75%. The last I checked, is around that range. 75% of people who release from these facilities come back. They're not reformed. So when you hear the term correctional facility, I like it. I don't want to say I laugh, but I'm like, really, guys, correctional facility. If you have a facility that's supposed to be fixing people, rehabilitating people, but 75% of the people who come into your system go home and then come back, how is that a correctional facility? What are they correcting? Anyway, NTB, man.